Matt Keane, welcome back to 7:30.
Thank you, Laura.
Earlier this month, the Climate Change Authority published a review of potential pathways to net zero emissions by 2050 that essentially said we aren't on track to reach the target of 82% renewable energy, didn't it?
What it said is that the clearest way to get to net zero by 2050 is to roll out renewables that are firmed up by batteries and other storage technologies at scale and quickly. So there was no time to delay. The electricity part of the economy will do the heavy lifting to help us get to where we need to be by 2050.
Well, you need to provide advice on the 2035 target next month to the government. Will that be made public?
What we'll be doing is doing the work necessary to ensure that that advice is independent and evidence-based. We need to go through a process. We're working with the CSIRO to ensure that the advice is science-aligned and achievable. We're working also with industry groups, so we'll take our time to get that advice right. We also consider the advice in the context of the international environment. Obviously, there's a major election coming up in the United States. We don't operate in a bubble. We operate as part of a global effort to reduce carbon emissions, and we'll be looking at the geopolitical environment before we provide that advice to the government of the day.
But will we see it? Will the public see it?
Yes, we'll be making sure that that advice is public.
You mentioned the best mix of policy to reduce emissions. We heard the opposition leader today outlining the case for nuclear. Does nuclear have a role to play?
Well, in the Sector Pathways report, the CSIRO clearly set out the pathway to transition our electricity system and meet our commitments, international and domestic commitments, was renewables that are firmed up with technologies like batteries and storage. That's the pathway that's been set out by the CSIRO. That's backed up by the Australian Energy Market Operator. They're the engineers who run our energy system. So we'll listen to the advice of the experts, and they clearly say the cheapest and most effective way to transition our electricity system is renewables that are backed up by firming.
Well, how important is investor confidence in maintaining the emissions reduction trajectory? I mean, how concerned are you that the spectre of a shift to nuclear power will undermine what needs to be done in the next couple of decades?
What's clear is that international capital and domestic capital will flow into building the generation, the storage and the firming technologies that we need to transition our grid and underwrite a new era of prosperity for our economy. That investment needs clear signals from government, and those clear signals are currently in place. We need to ensure that the pathways are there for that investment to come in to build the new replacement capacity that we're going to need, because AEMO, the market operator, have clearly said that the majority of our coal-fired electricity will be out of the system by 2038. In fact, 90% will be out by 2035. So we can't wait for 20 years to replace that capacity. We need to get on with the job now. The technologies are already available. They're wind, they're solar, they're batteries, they're other firming technologies backed up with new transmission. That's the cheapest way. It's also the most effective way to replace outgoing capacity.
Well, Peter Dutton said today that the Coalition sees renewables and nuclear as companions, not competitors. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think the advice from the CSIRO and the Australian Energy Market Operator is very different. We know that nuclear technology is not flexible to work with renewables, so therefore it isn't the best technology to support renewables. We also know that it will take a long time to build nuclear capacity. Australia doesn't have a nuclear industry. We don't have the workforce that's ever done this before. And the best example to look to is what's happening in the UK, another democracy that's currently building a nuclear power plant. That's the Hinkley Point C power plant. That process to begin that build started in 2007. It was scheduled to be completed in 2012. It now won't be turned on until 2028. That's over 20 years. The original price tag of that was $5.5 billion Aussie. The now price tag is the equivalent of $86 billion Aussie by 2028. So we can't afford to wait 20 years. It will be hugely expensive for taxpayers, and it will also be hugely expensive for electricity consumers.
Well, you've said that a fact-based discussion on climate change is required. The chair of the Superpower Institute, Rod Sims, said today the opposition leader had today made claims in support of nuclear power which, quote, aren't grounded in the latest economic facts. Do you agree with him?
My job as the independent chair of Australia's Climate Authority is to provide frank and fearless advice to the government of the day, independent, evidence-based advice. And clearly when it comes to energy policy, AEMO, the CSIRO have said clearly that the cheapest way to replace our existing capacity is renewables that are backed up by firming technologies. We'll take the advice of the experts. We're not going to get into ideology. This should be about evidence, science, engineering and economics, and that's the advice I'll be putting forward.
Well, given the Coalition is committed to a nuclear power plan, does the Climate Change Authority need to officially incorporate an assessment of nuclear energy in its next review? Because you essentially said last time, well, it's federally banned, so we're not going to look at it.
Well, the Climate Change Authority clearly has an obligation to map out the best way for Australia to meet its net zero by 2050 commitments. That's a policy that is supported by both sides of politics. We're providing independent evidence-based advice on the way to achieve that goal. And that clearly shows that in the energy sector, the pathway is renewables backed up by firming and other technologies will not only do its bit for the environment, not only help us meet our carbon targets, but also bring down energy prices for consumers.
Peter Dutton also said today that the cost of the renewables transition being proposed at the moment is between $1.3 and $1.5 trillion. Do you agree with that assessment?
What I agree with is that the cheapest way to replace our existing capacity is firmed renewables. That's not me saying that. I'll take the advice of the Australian Energy Market Operator, the engineers who run the electricity system, and the CSIRO. They clearly say that the cheapest way, the cheapest technologies to replace our existing forms of generation is renewables backed up by firming and storage.
At the time you were appointed chair of the authority, you reflected on advice you received as New South Wales Energy Minister, which was that nuclear power would take far too long and would be far too expensive. You said, quote, "I didn't want to bankrupt the state and I didn't want to put those huge costs onto families." Would nuclear power bankrupt Australia and impose huge costs on families?
Well, I'm not opposed to the idea of nuclear energy. I never was. We looked at it very closely when I was the New South Wales Energy Minister. The most persuasive advice I received was from the Chief Scientist of New South Wales, Professor Hugh Durrant-White. I asked him to explore that option for New South Wales. He clearly provided advice that it would take too long and would be far too expensive for taxpayers and consumers. Now, I didn't want to bankrupt the state and I didn't want to send electricity bills for mums and dads across Australia through the roof. That's why we took the advice of the CSIRO and AEMO and put forward the Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap, which provided a pathway for renewables to replace our existing coal-fired electricity. That's renewables that were backed up by technologies like gas, batteries and new transmission. And that was the advice of the experts.
Matt Kean, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Laura.